I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
James, how you doing today?
Great, Aaron. I'm always glad when Porter takes a vacation because I always like going on the show.
Well, man, we appreciate it, and we know we get a lot of positive feedback whenever Porter's out and you're able to sit in. We have a special guest on. It's somebody that you know well, Marc Eckō, who is a fashion designer. It's probably what he's most known for. But this guy's a stud entrepreneur and a venture capitalist. How do you know Marc?
Well, I basically have met him through, when his book was coming out, we both knew Ryan Holiday, and we started talking through that, and then just continued the conversation. So I was glad when he said yes to come on to the show.
Yeah, I think it's great. I've got some questions for him. I know that you'll have a lot of questions for him. Him and Ryan Holiday, I can imagine, have a lot in common because they're both the type of people that have the ability to reach real high connectors and create these kind of events for themselves where it's more pull marketing versus push marketing. And I know you've written about that too. So we'll kind of get into that in a little while. But before we do, let's jump into some kind of like financial headlines or some topics in the news right now. I want to get your take on a few things. This big debt ceiling debacle that, 2 weeks threatening to shut down the government, people freaking out, even though barely any of the government shut down. And they wasted a bunch of taxpayer money while they were, quote unquote, shut down. And by the way, they pulled in a ton of revenue. What's your take on that, James? Did it matter? Do you even care?
The answer is I don't even care, except for the fact that I wrote a funny article on my own blog about why I didn't care. Because the reality is, every year there's a new threat of, oh no, the federal government's going to shut down and we're all going to die or something. But the reality is, and I said this in my post, nothing is going to happen. And it's funny, so many people argued like, oh, the U.S. is going to lose its advantage in science, or, 2 million federal government employees are going to go without pay, or the U.S. is going to default on its debt, which shows me that A, people had no idea what a federal government shutdown means, and B, here we are. The stock market's at all-time highs, and there's no federal government shutdown. So I would rather talk about nudes than the news. So the news is always useless. They try to scare you. It's more like they're worried about a federal news shutdown, that there's no more news from the government, because that's the best way to scare people. Otherwise, newspapers will go out of business.
Yeah, so a couple of questions here. Number one, how well was that received?
Well, yeah, Aaron, by the way, why can't we talk about financial nudes? Why are we always talking about financial news?
I'd rather talk about financial nudes all day long, my friend. Let me ask you this. How was your blog received by people? Because whenever we burn it down like that, we get a lot of hate mail because we're un-American and because people have these like allegiances to their parties. How'd your audience receive it?
Well, I tried to make it just funny because to me, it really is just a joke, a whole notion of federal government shutdown. And you don't have to be like a card-carrying libertarian or a Democrat or a Republican to just, there's no reason to be annoyed or angry. This is just kind of mental masturbation that happens among politicians. But if I want to be happy and enjoy the sunshine and play tennis with my kids and read good books, I don't need to be worried about the federal government shutdown. It's going to happen. The newspapers are going to sell some newspapers, and it's going to then not happen. The newspapers will sell more newspapers, and the stock market will go to all-time highs. So the best thing is I even ignore the hate mail, which I did get as well. The only thing I would do is I never argue with the hate mail. I kind of just joke around with it because anybody who takes something like this seriously, you can't take seriously.
Yeah, and for those of our audience that don't know, you actually considered running for a congressional seat in your district until you did a little investigating and started talking to people and realized what a big sham it is. Briefly tell our audience about that experience. And I guess you know this better than anybody. You can see what these politicians are going to do a mile away from just a little that you dabbled into it, right?
Yeah, as soon as I put out the feelers and started hiring people to run for Congress, I was instantly sucked into the machine. Like presidential candidates already from 2016 were having their pollsters call and trying to get endorsements and trying to poll in my district and trying to see what my issues were, if they kind of matched up with the issues of the people of my district. And I was instantly felt this strong visceral reaction like, I can't do this because you can't change from inside the machine. If you're a widget in the car, you're not going to change the car. If you're the driver of the car, then you could change the car. And so the best way for me to be the driver is to actually stay outside the system, outside the machine, and do my own driving. Drive wherever I want instead of drive where, the car tells me to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let me go to the next topic. So, James, you've written a lot about the disappearance of the middle class. Porter's written The End of America. His thesis on The End of America revolves around the U.S. dollar losing its world reserve currency status. And, of course, that's all due to the Federal Reserve and inflating way and bad political decisions. Yours is a little bit different. You talk about the macroeconomics, which are the same, but you talk about how working for corporations is something that you can't rely on anymore. And frankly, a lot of jobs are disappearing because the workforce isn't keeping up with technology and companies will ruthlessly cut. Did you happen to see the brief outage of the EBT cards where Xerox servers kind of went down and literally within hours you had people looting Walmarts where police had to get called in and people were freaking out. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So this is related to food stamps and how people, some people rely on the government to help feed their families. And that's all great. It would be great if there was some power up above, whether it's the government or God or whatever you believe in, that's going to feed everybody. But the reality is that's just impossible. Like there's always going to be people who, if there's any central power that tries to feed you, they're going to fail to feed everybody. And so what's going to happen is people are going to start looting and just starting to try to take what's not theirs in order to get fed. So it's not a political thing. It's a personal thing. You have to take responsibility for yourself, not because that's so hard, but because you want your freedom. You want your freedom to feed your family. Don't spend on other things or, don't do the things that make it incapable of you getting a job or a source of income. You're going to need that source of income because there's nobody who's going to look out for you. The government is not going to look out for you. There is so much waste in the government, so much, so much of our tax dollars are then just funneled into the biggest lobbyists that it's just an extreme joke what happens. You can't rely on any aspect of it to either work or to work in your favor because nobody actually cares about you except yourself. And I don't mean this in a harsh way. You just have to take care of yourself first.
That's great advice. That goes back to your choose yourself philosophy. Speaking of waste, and I know you've done some kind of computer programming in the past. I believe you had a really solid story about when you were at HBO and you were trying to convince them that the internet was the next big craze, and they were kind of like, oh man, we're just like media people, like we're not really doing the internet. So you built an intranet for them, I believe, on some like outing,
yes.
and then they started to realize, oh hey, well wait a second, is that story accurate? Tell me how that went, because it's a good story.
Yeah, so I got hired there, and part of what I was doing was helping the cable side deliver interactive HBO to TV sets. And I said, look, you can do all of this if you just use the internet. And I remember my boss at the time telling me, James, I think the cable guys know a little bit more about this than you do. The internet is just for academics, so why don't you just do what we tell you to do? Meanwhile, fortunately, HBO didn't own HBO.com. So fortunately, they took my advice. They spent $250,000 to buy HBO.com. And then, like you said, I kind of on this over the weekend built an intranet to show them how it's used. And then we finally built an actual website. This is in the 90s. But from there, I started a company building websites for many entertainment companies, including some companies that intersected with what Marc Eckō's activities were. Like I did a lot of the websites for Loud Records, for Puffy's Bad Boy Records. So I was doing a lot of kind of the rap websites at that time, websites for all entertainment companies. A lot of it is related to, again, software is hard. There's a lot of the internet is easy, but that software is not complicated, and that's why the internet became popular. Is that no software on the internet is rocket science, but almost every other piece of software out there is a lot harder.
Yeah. So the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, was built on these exchanges, which is essentially software. So you enter your information, it takes in all of your kind of demographic information, and it gives you a quote for, this forced healthcare that people have to have if you don't have it, if you pay fees, taxes. And the company that won the contract to build the architecture, it was like a $97 million taxpayer award, which I think would be plenty of money. Well, of course, being the government, they, probably changed their specs or whatever, or the company lowballed them and fleeced them. It ended up costing taxpayers over $630 million so far, and it doesn't work at all. Now the experts have come in and looked at it and said, you know what? I don't even know if we can come back in and recode it. It might be at the bottom level of a database architecture where it just needs to be completely scrapped and rebuilt. James, is this something that is just typical of the government, or is it this complicated to program something like this?
It's this complicated, and you look at like Ronald Reagan. Star Wars. Okay, that's like a billion lines of code were suggested. It's impossible to debug that much code. So what they tried to do with Obamacare was outsource it to a company that was going to build it from scratch. I could tell you, and you could ask any internet programmer, for $1 million. Well, I'll even be generous. For $5 million, you could have programmed this entire operation without a glitch using basic internet programming skills. But instead, they decide, someone made an enormous amount of money on using my taxpayer dollars, your taxpayer dollars. We all pay taxes, and it's just a shame that we have no say at all on how our taxes are used and how they can be used efficiently. Like, who even hired this company to build Obamacare? Like, obviously it's going to be a mess. There's no way you could start from scratch. It's like building the internet from scratch and expecting it to work on the first go.
Yeah, it's a bit ridiculous. All right, well, that's enough of this for now. Let's get to Marc Eckō and let's get into the meat of the show today. Our guest today is Marc Eckō. Marc is an American fashion designer, entrepreneur, investor, artist, and philanthropist. He has a best-selling book, Unlabel, Selling You Without Selling Out. Marc, welcome to Stansberry Radio.
Oh, cheers, man. Good to be here.
James, take it away.
Well, Marc, first off, I have to say your book was excellent. The story is excellent. Your rise from, where you started to where you ended up, and all the kind of persistence and failure and kind of mojo to get you there was really impressive. I really enjoyed the book, and I highly recommend it to anybody.
Thank you, James. It means a lot coming from you, and I appreciate that very much.
I wanted to ask you, so many people find that their lives are dictated to them by the people who came before them. So, for instance, by their parents. And I feel like you were in danger of that happening to you. So your life story started off as essentially being dictated by your parents and where you were coming from. You were supposed to be a nice Jewish pharmacist, and then you went off and started the biggest kind of, hip hop fashion label. So what kind of advice would you give to someone who is constantly pressured by family and peers to do one route, but that's not the route that's going to make them happy?
Well, it wasn't really being dictated, I think, by my parents. Quite the contrary. My parents were pretty supportive. I think it often, that construct of who dictates is often, in your head. It's more of a social stigma. I had the fortune of being the only male in the family amongst all the cousins, and I think maybe that led to, with only having sisters and all female cousins, I think maybe I felt obligated culturally to follow in my dad's footsteps, but it wasn't like he really pressured that. And I think
sure, but there was some kind of almost then, like you say, cultural pressure or something that was outside of you that was kind of writing down the rules at first for you.
Yeah, I think it's often inside of you. I think it's often in your head. I think it's this kind of wanting to, please. You go through a K through 12 sentence. Everybody goes through the same 12-year sentence in their life, and you're taught to create evidence of your knowledge or get affirmation by from other people, right? It's your teachers, your advisors, the adult. That's the construct of pedagogy. So when you're 18 years old, doing something really just for yourself in a self-motivated, self-directed way is somewhat foreign. Other than just being a consumer and saying, I want those sneakers, I want that iPhone, really those kind of material decisions about your course are really very heavily handed and guided for us. So I think that pressure is often, created as a cultural thing, and it's often we're our own worst enemies by allowing those kind of paradigms and to exist. So, I had the good fortune of, effectively, I wasn't maybe able to communicate it in this way, but I started my business really as soon as I got my airbrush and air compressor at 14, 15 years old. So I think I had gotten kind of a head start and went to a vocational school, if you will, in my garage. So I had the kind of affirmation that with my hands I could do a trade that in the school, in my school system, I couldn't necessarily get the same kind of credit for. So I wasn't necessarily getting an A for it in school, but I was making more money than my drug dealer friends by painting T-shirts. So the affirmation was coming. I couldn't articulate it in that way that I was getting an education, but I look back on it and it really was my vocational training. It was a self-directed educational path. It was more adult learning centered. It was andragogy. It wasn't pedagogy. And I now at 41, I look back on that and I'm like, wow, that was kind of really special.
It's great also that you had this affirmation that you were creating what you viewed as art, but people were actually buying it. So I remember in your book, at first you were a little nervous about wearing your own clothes in school, but then everybody was like, hey, how can I get some of that?
Right. Yeah. I struggled, I was very kind of emotional about my art and my creativity, and kind of uncomfortable in my skin around that expression, really until I was almost damn near 30, and now as a grown man, I look back at that and I say, wow, how many of my peers and friends that remain scared and hid behind their art and kind of stuck in the safety of their own kind of emotional plastic bubble.
So what made you different from those friends?
I don't know. I think maybe it was, being a little naive. I don't know. Maybe I was, maybe a little bit, more naive, or maybe I was, because I was cast a little bit differently because I was, the white, chubby Jewish kid. It's like maybe I felt more of a need to, maybe gush or push it in ways that they didn't need to. I don't know. I don't really know. I think maybe I was more selfish. Maybe my twin sister gave me more confidence. Maybe I had. Maybe it was a little bit of my environment and my parents being, hustling real estate and being kind of entrepreneurial. Maybe it gave me the confidence to just parrot them. I don't really entirely know what made me different, but in an exact manner. But obviously there was a distinction.
It's interesting. You just said something that I think a lot of listeners and people in general have a problem with. You said, you had this issue up till 30 of being kind of self-conscious in your own skin, but now, quote unquote, you're a grown man at 41. So many people in their 20s think they already need to know their life purpose, their life vision, how it's going to work out from the ages of 25 to 65, but it just doesn't work out that way. And, even from 30 to 40, there's so many changes that could happen that you really have to survive. You're in the jungle then.
Yeah, it's true. And I think a lot of that is just because we have these expectations that we try to design and organize in such, rigid ways, much like how we try to organize our quarter or our next quarter, or we'll define success or the metric of success by finite numbers, definitive places that are absolute, and you design your expectations to try to follow those. And, emotional expectations are curvier and they zig and zag, and it's hard to not get frustrated. It's just human nature. But I think if you allow yourself the perspective of thinking of yourself as a creator, and if, I think maybe it's one of the things that as an artist that has taught me to think of each piece that I do in relationship to the entire body of work that I'll do over my whole life. So I don't think of exactly what I'm working on, that one canvas, that one creation, video, whatever it is, and I don't think of it as that, like as the end all be all. I'm allowed to screw up. It's allowed not to be perfect. It's allowed to be clunky. It has a meaning in the context of the body of work that I've done up until that point. And I don't think of it as like the beginning and the end. Though many from the buy side, many from, the buy side, meaning literally your buyers, if it's in business or in or even just people buying your ideas, right? They will say you're only as good as your last show. I think what gives you perspective is knowing that it's not a last show until either you lose your ability to perform or you're dead.
It's funny because in your book, you say something which I think is very different from the average entrepreneur. And it kind of, it's almost like there's not a tension, but you're really sort of this artist entrepreneur. You say you must move from the mindset of I am a consumer and I want X to I am a producer and I create. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are more focused on what can I make that the consumers are going to buy. But I think you started off being more focused on I'm an artist. What can I create? Then I'm going to sell it because I created it. And
I think that first of all, I think the entrepreneur is like the new black, right? It's so trendy and it's so like sexy and buzzy and people use it and I'm not a huge fan of the word, the notion, and I don't even like how a lot of the culture is kind of the entrepreneurial ecosystem has organized itself. It kind of fetishizes technology. It fetishizes it in a way as if that's like the best in class, best at pedigree, has to be a technology-based innovation, quote, capital efficient, to be, to really kind of wear like the latest in entrepreneurial thinking, right? And I think that that's a load of shit, frankly. So, I think that that's A. B is that the other reason I think that the word is not good, not because of its own fault, but because of the connotations we've assigned to it, is that it kind of organizes us as all motivated to just earn money, right? So there is this lust worthy for that kind of Tony Stark archetype, right? We say like, all right, who's like the Kanye West of entrepreneurs? That would be like Elon Musk, right? Like he's the Kanye of like the entrepreneurial scene, right? So, and Elon is, and we have this, we project onto him, right? Even though like he is been so honest, he's been really good about talking about failure and how painful it is. But we still fetishize like, oh my God, I could, make cars that fly, literally with the, rockets and so, or cars that, operate on a battery. And I mean, I need not believe that he was only motivated by cash. I mean, the dude himself was like stretched pretty thin financially. And I would probably even challenge to this day is probably has not really, gotten that big windfall of cash, a la, Mark Zuckerberg style yet. And because what he's pursuing isn't really the money, but like the mania of creating really unique emotional experiences. I mean, at the end of the day, what you're left with after it's not what you make, it's how you make people feel. And it's like when you walk away from the Tesla and, you're miles away from it, you don't own it, nothing, but you sat in it, you smelled the leather, you drove it, you experienced, charge. I mean, it makes you feel completely different about your relationship with, transportation. So that's what the business he's ultimately in, right? And he got there and beat other guys, one of which I invested in, which is, Fisker, because he just made it that path between the idea and the emotional transaction of how he made people feel was obviously just more succinct. He did it better.
Well,
tactically he did things maybe better. You could argue made better decisions with Panasonic and this, but fundamentally he just got the spirit in a more clear way.
I think that, that's a way also to describe kind of what you were doing through the 90s where, you even say in your book, if you can't express your idea convincingly in black and white, from a Xerox machine, then essentially the idea is probably no good. Like you have to be able to communicate clearly before all the venture capital money, which is, like you say, is all BS. Like you have to be able to have something that's good and quality.
Yeah. And I think, too much of this younger kind of tech-centric entrepreneurial ecosystem is so focused, because the nature of how venture money works is it's like, how are you going to get me 100x, a 200x? They're doing themselves a disservice when they ask the community to rationalize how a business is going to be successful and make the emotional part a nice to have. They basically like, oh, that's the warm and fuzzy part. That brand part, how you differentiate from like, a brand, like that's the nice to have. Like once we've created the evidence of revenue, we'll eventually get there. I mean, don't you remember Google? Their brand sucked, right? I mean, those are fucking anomalies, all right? Those are at times when it was the gold rush, right? There was less noise in the system. The notion of, how you're going to emote and your values and kind of your company's or your personal religion, how you're going to broadcast that, are not nice to haves. Okay? They are need to haves. And to think that
So how do you do that? How do you broadcast that?
Oh, I think you got to be tuned into what you're good at, and what you're not good at. And I think that it's like a muscle. It's like, I mean, I don't know about you, but I struggle to do pull-ups. I'm embarrassed to do them in public, but I do attempt to do them because I know they're good for me, right? So the question is how do people, instead of being antisocial or trying to hide behind the fact that they maybe have some kind of social idiosyncrasy in how they communicate to people, they think that all that, like if I could just short it and create like the algorithm or this kind of product innovation all by itself, no different than like an artist saying that, some kind of flourish, but then not be responsible to, think about how they're going to express it in a unique way and kind of create that user liquidity with less friction, then they're not doing themselves a service. Like they can't be like, oh, I need to hire the PR guy. Or I need to hire the publicist. I need to get the marketing guy. Oh, that's the nice graphic design guy. He'll get the UX all nice and sexy. Like I'll get to that later, right?
So let's say you have something of value, something that you believe in and you're passionate about. What would be your first steps if you were starting out to kind of get the word out, to basically create your own personal religion? If you were doing that right now, you did that for Marc Eckō, but let's say someone's new starting out right now. What would you do?
Well, it really depends on what product they're trying to express, right? It depends, what product and where in the market and what is it, how is it differentiated. So it's kind of an overly broad question, but there are best practices that you can apply. So for instance, one, we often are so consumed with just thinking, oh, if I only had access to that big name influencer, right? So, like, there's the spirit of, like, this influencer person X. In my case, in the music, it was like people in the music industry when I was coming up. How do I get access to them? So you have to ask yourself, it's like, well, how do you create an emotional transaction with them? So I've done things like, just sending handwritten notes and really bespoke custom packages to influencers with zero expectations of hearing back from them. Right? I call it swag bombs in the book. I talk about this. And, for someone who's in the B2B business or a SaaS services business, at the end of the day, every single product has an analog human need. There's a modality there that's human. So, like, it's bullshit to think like, oh yeah, I see how that works for fashion, but I'm in the financial services business, or I have some like processing thing that kind of makes my pipes faster than your pipes. Every product has the ability to express why it adds value from a human to human connection. So you need to think about that, and then think about like, oh, how do I swag bomb influencers in the market? And, those influencers need not be big names, right? They're just people that maybe within the trade are on the supplier side of the ecosystem. So, like, for instance, I didn't have money for ads, big, flashy, splashy display advertising or PR people when I first started. So what I did is I would just do as splashy as I can get in, quote, kind of the trade classified sections of the industry. Right? And I would go to people on the supplier side. The supplier side, like the under the hood parts, the guys that were the biggest truckers in the industry, the guys that maybe had the biggest screen printing facility, the guys that operated the biggest trade events. And I would market the out of myself to those B2B players and hitch my wagon to their star, because that's how I built credibility. Now, I might not on the buyer side, that might not have, immediate versus me just leaping right to, let me just win over the Macy's buyer. How do I win over the Bloomingdale's buyer, right? I won over guys on the supplier side so that they all, guys that were like gray hairs, been in the industry 10, 15, 20 years, said, this kid, I think you give him a shot, right? And it created value in a way that was a little bit of a slower burn, but it created more validity that I wasn't some fly-by-night kid, that I was hell-bent to win, and that I had enough intellectual awareness to win the hearts and minds of people that were in the middle of the supplier side and weren't necessarily consumer-facing.
James, let me jump in here real fast, Mark, too, because I think you're bringing up a huge point. So, I know a lot of people are going to listen to this interview, and they're listening to two highly successful entrepreneurs, and they're thinking, yeah, but these guys are just so different. And one of the things that I know that you emphasize, Mark, is taking action. And like you said earlier, take action, but without expectations.
Yeah.
Now, and I know you really couldn't identify what's inherently in you that made you successful, what your belief system is. Mm-hmm. But, I'm sure you received massive amounts of criticism starting off, and a lot of people saying that you couldn't do it. How were you able to block that mindset and to stay in action mode without expectations?
Yeah, here's the thing. I'm 41. I'm, as successful goes, I'm modestly to successful, right? I've accomplished a lot. I have a pretty high batting average, I don't want to brag, but I've done some things that other people in the industry with a lot more money have tried, and I've done it better, right? Despite that, I'm still always auditioning. I'm still always getting stage fright, like every day. Okay? So it's a fallacy to think just because you've earned your stripes that they aren't going to audition your ass all the time. And I think people want the comfort. They want that kind of being in that emotional bubble to not have either their feelings hurt or be embarrassed to dance off rhythm in public, right? There's this hesitation to I'm not cool enough or confident enough to wear my sunglasses inside, right? So they don't do it, and they're fundamentally afraid. Or when they do it, they do it kind of in a volume, right? And it need even be in a loud, precocious volume, but they just don't do it in a way that expresses who the they are and how they differentiate. They do it modestly, incrementally, right? And then they get frustrated. Why isn't someone noticing? Right? Because you're not honestly, from in an intellectually honest fashion, differentiating. You're not using the very things that maybe make you peculiar, that make you quiet, that make you shorter or taller or fatter or whatever it is, female, male, black, white, brown, yellow, whatever it is. You're not using those devices in a Tai Chi-like manner to define who you are, rather than trying to parrot to what you think people want to see or hear, right? So, action is a scary thing, man. There's a reason they say leap of faith, right? There's a reason they say leap of faith. Leaps are scary. There's some scary shit. There's rocks, water crashing, right. There's alligators under. That's scary. They didn't say skip of faith. They didn't say, step of faith, little puddle. You lay down the jacket, you say, here you go, ma'am, you walk over. It doesn't look like that.
But there's something interesting, though, too, which is that you would send these, swag bombs to everybody. It was almost like you were taking lots of multiple leaps of faith at the same time. You were making authentic communications from what you felt had value to other people you felt had value, and you were doing it simultaneously to maybe lots of people with no expectations back. So that's how you mitigated the risk of all of these leaps of faith.
And I did it in a means which I could afford, right? It wasn't like it cost me my time, my hand, my efforts. It wasn't like I was like people, they're like, oh, swag bomb, oh, that's expensive. It needn't be expensive, man. It just needs to be well thought out. It needs to show that you gave a F and that you were deliberate in thinking about how do I make this bespoke? How do I make this custom? Show that I am aware of the things that matter to this person because I did enough to look them up and not just like LinkedIn stalk them, but like you really cared to figure things out. And there's a power there. Like I have to this day, there are people that I didn't necessarily ever respond to me, but years later saw me to go on to be successful, and they acknowledged, they're like, I remember that, man. And like that, so I could testify that you're the real deal.
I wanted to get real quickly to the title of your book, Unlabel. Obviously, there's sort of the clothing metaphor here, but what else does it mean to you? Because there's sort of the philosophical context as well.
Oh, I use the framework of labels because there's a kind of a double entendre, obviously. There's or triple, but one where my brand was called Eckō Unlimited, right? So I've always played on the notion of I like the idea of not in like the nihilistic sense, but in like the sense where you refuse. So like you refuse to limit yourself. I often say unapologetic. If refuse to have a default disposition of saying sorry all the time, right? Especially when it comes to being self-made. So the unlabel has a bunch of meanings in that regard. And then there's obviously, I talk about the sale of my business, which funny enough, I'm back now, just very serendipitously involved in the business for the first time in 5 years in a material way. Now is operating the business. So there's a lot of meaning there. But really what it means from a philosophical level to the reader, and I think would be important for the audience, is the notion of like, look, you are going to be assigned a label, right? Your label is your exterior packaging. It's the flourish. It's your skin. It's how I perceive you, right? And I tell people the world's going to try to organize you that way. They're going to try to package you in this taxonomy of saying you're in aisle 4, don't even dare go to aisle 7 because aisle 7's where, the meat is, and you're frozen or you're dairy, you belong in 4, right? So you have to refuse to be labeled. You have to aspire to be an unlabeled. So the book, uses that framework to talk about, branding and personal branding, and to frame it in a way that, it's a little philosophical. There's no doubt. It's a little, philosophical. The reason it's philosophical is because the reality about this stuff is that it can't be mechanical and prescriptive. Okay, that's if you're looking for those kind of mechanical and prescriptive books, they've been written, and I don't think there's been one written in the landscape of branding that's really, intellectually honest of how to execute. Like, because you can't just say, all right, here's the punch list, check these boxes, and boom, add water, get cake, instant brand. It doesn't work like that. So, I use a framework throughout the book where I say the anatomy of the brand is built on the spine of authenticity. And I model authenticity in a slightly oblique philosophical way with the purpose of saying, to almost take the piss out of those classic, here's the 7 habits, or this is the, here's the art of the deal, and kind of take the piss. Not that those books aren't purposeful and haven't governed and inspired, because I think certainly they have. But I try to build a business book from a more of an emotional, creative place for the creative class, the people that aren't necessarily just externally, like Dan Pink would say, externally motivated. And that's what I attempted to do, and that's what hopefully, in a long-winded answer, the unlabeled word is attempting to mean.
No, that's great. And it was, like I said, I highly enjoyed the book. I highly recommend it to any of the audience. It was really an inspiring story.
Thank you, James. Like I said, it means a lot to me that you say that.
Yeah, and real quick, Mark, before we let you go, and again, thank you for your time very much. I really discovered who you were. I knew your brand. I knew your clothes. I knew everything about that, but I really discovered who you were with the whole Barry Bonds number 756 ball that he, eclipsed Hank Aaron. And I voted on your website. And that was years ago, obviously. Tell our listeners a little bit about this process that you went through. I think you paid $750,000 for the ball.
Yeah.
And then you gave voters the option, 3 different options, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And I think you had like some ridiculous amount of like 10 million visits or votes to that.
It was almost 11 million votes in total. It was crazy. I imagine some of that might have been bots because it was just so explosive. But it was also explosive as a news story. I mean, look, that was in the book. I talk about the range of emotional impact, and I try to use the metaphor of distance, the distance between your end consumer, your audience, and the feeling, the sense. And I wanted to, and I've often aspired to create unique emotional experiences. So here we were. It was pre-TARP, right? The whole world was jacked up on some sort of performance-enhancing substance. I mean, every industry, right, our financial industries. I myself, from an ironic point of view, and I talk about it in the book, had my own sort of financial instruments that had me jacked up with massive lines of credit that were probably somewhat make-believe in retrospect. But there was this great debate, and, the ball was at the center of it, and this is baseball, and it's American pastime. People were debating all over the place, and just this window of opportunity came, and I'd done things prior, sort of, oblique things like, tagging Air Force One, as a means to marketing a video game, the President's Air Force One plane. And in this instance, I heard that the ball was going to be on an auction, and it just seemed like what a great foil, and what a kind of hot potato to take advantage of like a hard news story, and at the same time try to create almost an American Idol kind of moment where people get to vote on the fate of the ball. So we put it up, and we said you could either send it to the Hall of Fame as it is, unmarked, acknowledging the record as clean and no debate on this performance enhancing substances in baseball. B, send it to the Hall of Fame with an asterisk on it, where it would be laser etched on the ball, to the Hall of Fame, quote, defaced, permanently, footnoting the ball in a literal sense. Or C, putting it on a rocket and launching it into the deep, deep orbit just to make it go away forever and make this silly debate, something that we just don't want to talk about anymore. So that was the concept, and it was voted to send to the Hall of Fame with an asterisk, and that's where the ball is. And it really, as I say in the book, and I started on this with this note, it was really about, how do you make people feel, for better or worse? And it was a unique device to kind of create some awareness around my name versus just people associating the brand and me explicitly to the Rhino. And I could have used that very same marketing dollars, $750,000. Let's say it was closer to $1 million once you put in, other types of costs associated to actually market it and deploy the message. But I could have used that $1 million for display media. I could have bought billboards in Times Square. I could have done all that, and in 3 months, no one would remember. And here we'd be years later, and I'd say, "Hey, do you remember I spent $1 million on a billboard in Times Square?" And you'd say, "No, I don't remember." So, I mean, it was just one of those perfect storms of right time, right place, right story, and the ability to kind of act out on what was otherwise maybe viewed as kind of a crazy idea.
Well, I thought it was great. And by the way, for the first time ever, my vote mattered and it counted because I said put the asterisk on it, send it to the Hall of Fame, which you did. And Mark, hey, I appreciate your time so much. I know we've gone a little bit over. You're very gracious, and I hope our audience got a lot out of it. We'll certainly put a link to your book for all of our audience. We will advise them to pick it up, and you've given some great wisdom here.
Well, we really appreciate the opportunity. I certainly appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for having me on. Hopefully the audience got something out of it, and I'm sorry if I came off I wasn't yelling. I'm just emphatic.
Yeah, you're passionate. It's great.
Yeah, so, cheers. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, take care. Bye.
Peace.
James, thank you for bringing Mark on. I personally got a lot of valuable information out of it.
Yeah, it's huge. I'm a big fan of his, so it was great to have him on the show.
And he really understates his story to a degree that shows a lot of humility or being extremely humble because he, this guy came from nothing and he's worth a ton of money. He says he's moderately successful. Forget that, man. This guy is unbelievably successful. He literally created an entire niche for himself out of nowhere in the hip hop community, much like the Beastie Boys did. You know, it's a white Jewish kid earning mega respect in a very, hardcore urban environment, and he created a clothing line for him that's still to this day a great brand. It's very impressive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny how many, it sort of seems funny, like a white Jewish guy getting in this business, but you have, Marc Eckō, you have Steve Rifkin, who started Loud Records, which basically developed the Wu-Tang Clan. You have, Dave Mays, Harvard educated white Jewish guy who started the Source magazine, which was the biggest hip hop magazine out there at the time. And it's funny how, those cultures mixed.
Yeah, it is definitely funny. It's not something that people would really think about, but they mix very well. All right, James, before we get out of here, let's talk about your silent retreat that you were just on. Claudia loves to put these things to you, and I'm so impressed that you are able to make it through these. It makes me want to challenge myself and try it out sometime. And you always have a great autoresponder that you put up for your email. What was the purpose of this last one? What did you personally learn, and what have you accomplished by doing that?
Well, I've written 11 books, but I've never written a book with someone. So now Claudia and I are writing a book together. So Claudia is my wife. We're writing a book together, and it's called The Power of No. And it's about how important it is to basically say no to the things that are trying to trap you. So whether it's, we talked a little bit about this in the Marc Eckō interview just now, the things that try to label you, or the things that try to put some sort of peer pressure on you, or some sort of cultural pressure on you, or even, just on an individual basis, like, oh, you always have to treat your family this way and your friends this way. There's all these rules about government, school, friendships, family that we're supposed to follow. But how do you actually say no so that you personally are free and happy? Because the only way everyone around you is going to be free and happy is if it starts with you and you surrounding yourself with people like yourself. So we went on this retreat because for one thing, it's always nice to get away from all the business calls and so on. And the other thing, we were writing probably 5,000 to 10,000 words a day on this book while we were there. So it wasn't just about like kind of meditation and taking walks in the trees and stuff. We were hardcore, writing this book. We probably wrote 60,000 words in 10 days. And it's going to be exciting when the book comes out.
Yeah, that's very impressive. That's fantastic. I should shut the world off sometimes and do that because I know I'll accomplish a lot more because I get in these OCD loops, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
where it's like check your cell phone, check your email. You're like I'm like a robot, a slave to technology sometimes, and I hate it.
Me too. Like you wake up at 3 a.m. and like, okay, I got to go to the bathroom and check my emails. Cause cause you think you're deluded, or I'm deluded into thinking somewhere at like 2:30 a.m, someone has sent me Oprah has sent me an email.
Right.
And President Obama has sent me an email that I have to reply to quickly. So, but when you're on one of these retreats, you get really disconnected bit by bit, every day a little bit more disconnected until your mind is finally free to be itself so that you can get work done. And it's a real pleasure.
Well, listen, James, it's great. Thank you so much for bringing Mark on. Thank you for sitting in for Porter. You always do an excellent job. And
Thanks.
As always, we encourage our audience to pick up Choose Yourself if they haven't already, I know that we've had a lot of our audience has, and we've received a ton of feedback. And a lot of times you're making an impact in their lives in little ways that hopefully can compound itself to provide that kind of inner confidence that Marc Eckō talked about and you talk about, and can propel people to not really rely on the government or their employers or anyone else, because like you talk about all the time, you can't count on anybody but yourself. So
right, look at like what Marc even said too, like how he would personally created something of value that was inexpensive, and that he himself built up the authentic communications, not with different companies or brands, but with the people that inhabit those companies. Because ultimately, any institution is made up of people with their own worries, their own desires, their own needs. And it's those authentic communications that not only build a career, but build your life. And that's what's important to connect to.
Well, James, thank you so much. I know we'll talk to you soon, and I look forward to catching up in New York.
Stansberry Radio is a purely public broadcast and is not intended to be personalized financial advice for any individual specific situation. Each individual's financial situation is unique, and Stansberry Radio should not be relied upon and or considered as personalized advice. Stansberry Radio is not licensed to render personalized advice and should be considered simply the public opinions of Stansberry Radio and its guests. Recommendations on specific financial securities are not intended to address any listener's particular financial situation.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.